Sorry about that. All right, so welcome to Module 6. This is the point when we really start to firmly dig into naturalism. And our means for doing that is by digging into Charlotte Perkins Gilman and the yellow wallpaper. When we completed milestone 2, I had several students who used Gilman, and this work in particular, to speak to how realism impacted its world. In those cases, I asked that the students remember what they said about Gilman and realism for when we got to this point. That sounds a little ominous, but what I really want to talk about is the matter of ambiguity and how it plays in such a monumental role in literature, and in fact, writing and communication of all kinds. So keep that kind of general point in mind for a minute. When we look at the yellow wallpaper, we can make a case for it being realism. It clearly has a moral purpose in mind. That's not really something most people would debate. While it doesn't have the classic structure of a realist narrative, one that allows us to see the character making choices for the good as a model for the reader, we also have to acknowledge that other realists constructed stories in different ways too. So one famous example is The Beast in the Jungle. That's from 1903 by Henry James. No one is going to say Henry James is not a realist. In that story, the character realizes that the choices that he's made, well, they're wrong. And the choice that he should have made, it's too late for. All right. So the whole thing turns into a tragedy. Yet this tragedy shows the reader a lesson. Don't be like this guy, do the right thing. So we can make a claim for Gilman doing the exact same thing with the yellow wallpaper. Realist fiction also has a real penchant for broadcasting inner monologue to highlight what's going on in the thought processes of its characters. So they're actually going to be reflecting on what's going on around them. And needless to say, that sounds like what's happened, how the yellow wallpaper works. So, maybe realism. Now, with that said, we can also look at the same story and make a point about it and naturalism. Again, naturalists like to feature moral lessons in their work, but they regularly used negative examples, even prefer negative examples. So that fits in with naturalism pretty well. We also have that feature that I talked about in my announcements last week, the idea of stuckness, how our central character is, for intents and purposes, really a prisoner of her husband at this remote house where he's treating her as her physician. Now, I also mentioned determinants or compulsions, as Fleischner terms them. These are forces outside of the character's control that demand certain things from the character. In this case, she is somehow not measuring up as a wife or mother because of her nervous problem. So this relates her issue back to being what a woman should be. All right. So again, if there's a conception that she should be a certain way, that has very little to do with what she is or what she might want. All right. So we can see that there are forces exterior to her that are making demands on her. And that fits really well for this idea of compulsion or determinants. All right. So maybe good for naturalism. So that's good so far. And I know for a fact that I've read critics talk about the story in relation to both movements. So you are welcome to do so too. However, we can also put Gilman's story into another light entirely. And this is not a focus of our course, but I think it's important to see. The yellow wallpaper works amazingly well within the traditions of Gothic literature. And this form has, practically speaking, nothing whatsoever to do with realism or naturalism. Gothic lit has viewpoints very similar to the Romantic. And I'll just say, the Gothic has been with us from the start of our nation and remains with us today and is still a favorite. I recommend taking a look, if you want to go back to the beginning, taking a look at any of the fiction, and I mean any, by Charles Brockden Brown. And he's one of the earliest novelists from our country. He turned 18 the year the Constitution was ratified and started putting out novels in the first years of the US. A central feature of the Gothic is the remote and unsettling location. And rather than a castle, Gilman puts us in the hills in the US South on what reads very much like an old plantation house. So not a bad substitute. The main character in a Gothic story is traditionally a woman who is unusually sensitive, but who is also primed to play a role as a romantic partner within the confines of the story. Lastly, and essentially, what we think of as Gothic, the ghostly action, the spooky bits that take place in the story always turn out to be, and this is a feature of classic Gothic storytelling, they always turn out to be just in the head or in the imagination of the female character. Her dependence on the male lead sets up her maturing away from frivolous imaginings and becoming, wait for it, a successful partner, meaning future wife and mother. So the male that she's depended on to help guide her through this and get past her silliness winds up being, her love interest, and they live happily ever after. That's how Gothic stories end. All right. Needless to say, Gilman turns that expectation on its head a bit, but the elements are all there. So rather than it being straight Gothicism, we could easily make a case that it's a play on Gothicism. And that really kind of just amounts to the same thing. So what is the truth of it? Which is it? Is it realism, naturalism, Gothicism? And this is the time to go back to what I mentioned a minute ago about ambiguity. The fact is, Gilman wrote an extremely successful story because it could morph in so many directions for so many readers. We can take her later arguments explaining her story in a certain way as the truth. However, it's 10 years down the road and she's got an agenda as an editor, and she just says, hey, this story I wrote was meant to do this. And, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. Who's to say? We can't question Charlotte at the moment. So even if we could, would she tell us the truth? Would she know the truth looking back on things? Again, we have to ask these questions. So ambiguity, it's wonderful. And it's what makes storytelling such an art form. So your job is to try to see through the ambiguities and to piece together the kinds of evidence from the story that makes sense to you about what's happening and how it fits in with things, and to figure out what is supportable, where there actually is evidence to show these. All right. That's our business. That's what we're doing. All right. So this week we have another short writing, and it is basically to talk through what is going on in defining naturalism. And, if you've got questions on that or on anything, you know by now how to get a hold of me. And till next time, adios.